Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the fourth episode of the Policy Pulse, a podcast brought to you by the Chaudhry Nazar Department of Economics at LUMS. I'm Ayesha Ali, an assistant professor in the Department of Economics at LUMS. And today I'm very pleased to introduce my guest, Professor Saad Gulzar, who's an assistant professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University. Previously, Saad was an assistant professor of political science at Stanford University. Saad holds a PhD in politics from New York University, and he has masters in public policy and public administration. Saad is also an alumni of LUMS. He did his bachelor's in economics at LUMS. We're very pleased to have you, Saad. Welcome to the podcast today. Our theme for today's podcast is going to be to discuss climate and environmental management in the developing world. This is a very timely and critical policy issue, as many developing countries are at the forefront of climate change impacts, and yet they have limited resources to cope with these impacts. Now, Professor Saad's work speaks to these issues. And today specifically, we'll discuss two of Saad's research papers, which have been published in Nature and American Political Science Review. So first, Saad, let me welcome you to the podcast.
Thank you. Good to be back.
Thank you. And let us begin our discussion by talking about air pollution. Air pollution is a public health emergency in South Asia, leading to around 2 million deaths every year. Lahore, where we're sitting currently, has a very hazardous air quality for most of the year. So let me begin with a very simple question. What leads to air pollution?
Well, thanks again for having me. It's a great honor to be back at LUMS. So this paper that I've written on air pollution, I'm not really an expert on air pollution, but my research has been mostly on the governance side and thinking about public goods in general. And I happened to get into air pollution primarily because I witnessed the phenomena as it unfolds every year in Pakistan. So that led me to question, okay, what are exactly the causes of air pollution? And especially from a governance angle, how can we approach them? And of course, like many public policy problems, the causes are complex. We know from the literature that air pollution is caused both by sort of human-led causes and non-human-led causes. So human-led causes include things like industrial emissions, vehicular emissions, crop burning, which is the focus of my paper. And then there are also non-human causes of air pollution, such as wildfires, which have increasingly also now started occurring because of human intervention. So, air pollution is not something that's completely human induced, but this level of air pollution that is sustained throughout the year is often caused by human intervention.
So let's turn to your work. And could you please describe for me what you do in your paper and what specifically do you find about how to control air pollution?
So this paper is joint work with Jama Dipapa, who's an assistant professor at Brown University. In this paper, we try to think about what are the governance challenges vis-a-vis controlling crop burning specifically, which is said to cause about half of peak pollution in South Asia during the winter months and the harvest months when rice is harvested. So what we were interested in was thinking about this idea that air pollution, especially crop burning, is from a governance perspective often seen as intractable, something that cannot be controlled by policy levers. And we were trying to think about, okay, is there still some variation that we can see in policy behavior, despite this idea that overall this problem is increasingly seen as intractable? So what we wanted to study what happens when the incentives of people who are in charge of controlling air pollution change, and whether those changes in incentives yield some changes in air pollution, or can we visibly see that they're exerting some influence over air pollution? And the hypothesis going in was that if indeed the problem is intractable, then any changes in incentives should not really yield any changes in the outcomes of interest. But in fact, what we saw was that there is significant variation that's produced in polluting behavior, specifically crop burning. That's what we focused on, when changes occurred on the incentive side of the government agents, specifically district bureaucracy, when those incentives changed. So what we did in the paper was we tried to think about what are some ways in which we can gain some data-driven traction on the incentives of the bureaucrats who are in charge of controlling crop burning. And again, we looked at the entire northern Indian subcontinent. So, because we didn't really do a case study in one specific location, we needed to rely on some data sources that were available for this wide area. So what we did was we looked at satellite data, which allows us to study a few things. One, we can study crop burning from space because each incidence of crop burning is a thermal event that's detected by satellites, and there's a daily data set that NASA puts out that you can use. From that, you can see crop burning. So on the outcome side, we had one measure. Then we were thinking about, okay, what are some ways in which we can capture the incentives of the bureaucrats who are in charge of controlling air pollution? And we got this idea that it must be the case that bureaucrats care more about controlling air pollution in their own location versus air pollution that goes to neighboring jurisdictions. This idea is kind of important vis-a-vis air pollution in particular compared to some of the other public goods that you might think about, because in this case, the act of polluting, so the person who's burning the stubble left over from their rice crops, is located usually in one location, and the places that bear the brunt of the pollution are not necessarily in the same location, the location being the actual district of the bureaucrat. So we try to gain some leverage on which areas inside a bureaucrat's own jurisdiction are going to pollute their home jurisdiction, and which areas are going to pollute the jurisdiction of other bureaucrats. And we gain leverage on this through changes in wind direction. So again, the idea being, if I'm a bureaucrat and somebody is burning their stubble on the edges of my jurisdiction, if the wind is going to take away the pollution to my neighbor, I'm going to care less about that particular polluter versus if the wind was bringing in pollution to my own jurisdiction. So I use this idea, again, getting satellite data on wind directions, and I show in the paper that this example that I just gave you, the same farmer, if the wind were to blow air pollution into my own jurisdiction, I would be about 15% more likely to curb air pollution versus if it were to take pollution away from my jurisdiction. So that's the first big idea in the paper, which is that in fact, in the data, even with status quo incentives, a problem that is considered intractable, actually there is meaningful variation in outcomes. So it is the case that people who are assigned to look after this problem are in fact responding to the incentives that they face locally to control the problem. So that immediately dismisses this idea that the problem is completely intractable and nobody can do anything about it. So that's the first finding in the paper. The second finding in the paper relates to this idea that, I told you why air pollution is a hard problem to solve. One, because there are millions of dispersed agents who are making the decision to do crop burning. And from a specific bureaucrat's perspective, controlling any one crop burner doesn't yield as much of a marginal gain as it would in the case of, for example, stopping a factory from polluting, right? Because the total amount of pollution that from one factory is probably going to be much, much larger than from just one farmer. So that means that it's going to be hard for bureaucrats to exert effort because the marginal gain from each unit of effort is much lower for controlling one particular farmer. So in the second part of the paper, we kind of challenge this idea and we ask, is it the case that if I, as the bureaucrat, go after one particular crop burner, is there deterrence created among other farmers in the area? And so we show some evidence of this, that in fact what we find is when bureaucrats control crop burning in their area, other farmers actually reduce crop burning, anticipating further, particularly in areas where they anticipate further bureaucratic action. So that's the second part of the paper. And in the final part of the paper, we go back to this question of what are the specific, what are the stakes involved in some of these things that I've just talked about vis-a-vis bureaucratic action. And of course, the stakes involved have to do with public health. And there are multiple elements of public health that you can think of. Everybody around us in Lahore is coughing right now. They're wheezing, sniveling. So that's on a daily basis a loss of economic productivity that you see. That's a little harder to capture because obviously data for the entire northern Indian subcontinent on health outcomes on an ongoing basis is not really available. So instead, what we do is we focus on one aspect of public health, which is maternal and child health. And we get data from DHS surveys, and we estimate the effect of crop burning specifically. There's some technical aspects of this, which I'm happy to talk about. But we isolate the effect of crop burning pollution from other parts of air pollution that mothers, when they're pregnant, are exposed to. And we show that about a 1 log point increase, which is not quite a doubling of the effect, but round about there. So 1 log point increase of air pollution exposure over mean air pollution exposure actually increases child and infant mortality by a large amount. It goes from something around 29 in 1,000, 27 in 1,000 1,000 births to something like around 50. So there's a huge increase in mortality for infants and children just from in utero exposure to air pollution caused by crop burning.
So this is really fascinating, Saad, and leads me to my next question. So you focused on the incentives of one type of economic actor, mostly the bureaucrats. Do you have any thoughts about what policies or programs would work to sort of create incentives for other actors, such as the polluters, let's say the crop burners or the factories, or the average citizen? Because you're documenting large negative effects on average citizens. So I wonder, what kind of incentives should be there for them to sort of demand more clean air, or polluters to pollute less?
So I think that's a very important and under-examined question. There's very limited research on how to mobilize collective action against something like air pollution, because the health effects of air pollution are not immediately felt, and people have a harder time connecting any effects that they might face, for example, coughing, with specific policy failures. And again, the reason here is that the jurisdiction in which you might feel pollution is not necessarily the jurisdiction in which the pollution act occurs. So from an incentives perspective, this creates, or from a political economy perspective, this creates really perverse incentives for policymakers, because the effects that the citizenry will feel are delayed so much that there's less pressure on them to act right now. And you can kind of see this in the policy landscape, that many of the policies that are suggested are always exposed and during the smog season. And they're kind of policies that are sort of a band-aid approach to the problem instead of more structural, or instead of resolving more structural issues that are causing the problem to begin with. One example that immediately comes to mind is, for example, smog towers, which are, part of the policy discussion these days. I think Lahore even commissioned a smog tower a couple of weeks ago. One smog tower, first of all, is not going to make any difference. I think there was an estimate, somebody had done that to reduce Delhi's air pollution via smog towers. You needed something like more than 40,000 smog towers to even have a dent in air pollution. But then I think the more fundamental issue is that you're attacking the problem of air pollution exposed, and not really designing a policy to root out the structural issues. And I think my paper is not really about the structural issues either, because it's about management or managing the current problem. I'm well aware that, for example, farmers are also a poorer part of the population. They're not the poorest, but they are a poorer part of the population. And what I don't want to take away from this paper is that actually the government should go after farmers in isolation. What I want people to take away is that while you think of structural solutions being a very intensive cropping pattern, overuse of water resources, which makes sense, because of food security reasons. So the problem is very complex. But while you think of those solutions, there is something you can do to immediately mitigate the huge public health impact that these policies are having. And so that's kind of the policy scenario with which sort of I'm envisioning my work. Your question was about incentives of non-policy actors. I think the incentives are, as I suggested, such that the kinds of political economy pressures one would imagine, given the scale of the emergency, do not exist. And there are some good economic reasons for that.
Right. Thank you, Saad, for that. So now let's turn to your work on forest conservation. So this is an issue I feel which is always under the radar, when we have policy discourse in Pakistan. But as you say in your paper, deforestation and degradation of forest cover actually accounts for 10 to 15% of greenhouse gas emissions globally. So protecting as well as expanding green cover will be essential in our sort of pursuit towards a balanced carbon economy. You've looked at forest degradation in India and the role that local institutions play in sort of protecting forest areas. Can you please describe the context of that work and your key findings?
Sure. So this paper is trying to think about forest conservation. Again, I approach this question from a governance angle, which is really my bread and butter in terms of research. And the question that I had in mind here was situated in academic work that tries to sort of understand this, again, problem of externalities and how we should think about it in terms of where in the policy ladder we should introduce institutions. So the problem here is one of overlogging or deforestation, right? And so the classic economic solution has been that, okay, you centralize authority, and that should allow a policymaker or social planner to kind of incorporate the externality in their decision. And that's the classic solution. But since Ostrom, for example, people have considered or thought very carefully about the role that local institutions play. And the reason for this is that there's always a trade-off between centralizing and decentralizing in terms of as you decentralize, you have more and more local knowledge in how to use a resource. All of this local knowledge can really improve the conservation of some of these resources. But at the same time, there's a risk that as you go local, you don't really price in the externality, and therefore there might be overexploitation. So there's always that trade-off. But what we found was that in the literature, when people try to evaluate the effect of decentralization of power, they found mixed evidence of that, which is in some cases it led to an improvement in conservation, forest resources in particular, and in other cases it actually led to an improvement. So there was a trade-off, or there was mixed evidence that we kind of confronted when we looked at the literature. So we have the claim in this paper that in fact decentralization of policy or authority is not enough. You need to incorporate that with real discretionary powers or a policy mandate at the local level. So specifically what we wanted to study was the effect of the devolution of political power in a decentralized context in India. The policy context that we study is that of scheduled tribes who are, quote unquote, indigenous populations of India. They're vastly, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a set of population that are very diverse. That's the word I'm looking for. It's a diverse population, but under the British, they were codified as scheduled tribes so that the state could manage this population that was characterized to be very marginalized. They lived, a large majority of them lived in these areas called scheduled areas that were fixed under the British. But what happened was during the 2000s, the government of India actually implemented these series of reforms where local government at the village level was introduced in these scheduled areas. And in these local governments introduced a mandated representation for scheduled tribes, who are sort of these populations that in many cases are sort of forest dwelling. And there's a whole history of them having a relationship with the forest, which is more conservation oriented than more commercial uses of the forest. And so what we study is the rollout of this policy, and we show that when the scheduled tribe population received this boost in political power, actually forest conservation, so at the local level, forest conservation actually improved, which is contrary to the claim by many scholars that decentralization will actually reduce the conservation of forests. And so then we do a bunch of other analysis in the paper, but we show that, or we claim that this improvement in political power allowed scheduled tribes to fight off more commercialized interests like mining, which again are controlled by higher level governments such as state governments in India. So the takeaway for us was that one reason why there's mixed evidence from decentralization of power in the literature is because local communities need to receive power not just in word but also in practice. And this was a policy where not only was power, which is control over forest resources, devolved to the local level, but political power was also transferred, which actually enabled them to exercise some of their power at the very local level.
Right. So thank you for sharing those insights with us. So this brings me to my next question, which is, what do you foresee as the role of local governments versus national governments in managing natural resources like forests, water bodies, or even in ensuring clean air?
I mean, I think that's a question that's going to be very context dependent. So, in the forest case, we had this trade off between having a more centralized policy, let's say, of mining, versus having more specific knowledge at the local level, such as how to manage forest resources or organize against overexploitation of forest resources. So, the relationship between local and more centralized government will be very specific to a particular policy. But I think what my research is showing is that taking in the incentives of local agents seriously allows us insights into this idea that local agents are able to actually affect a lot more change that might be commonly assumed, both in the air pollution case, where local district bureaucracy is able to exercise a significant amount of power in the control of the environment. I show it specifically in the case of crop burning, but that doesn't mean that that's the only place where they can exercise power. They can also exercise power in terms of introducing some kind of standards for industrial emissions, vehicular emissions. And in fact, the way our government is structured, there is no way that a central government is going to be able to implement any policy at scale without incorporating the incentives of the local agents. So that's how I view it, which is you might do policy formulation at the central level, but the implementation will always be with local agents in mind. And keeping their incentives in mind is going to really improve the efficacy of the policy.
Right. So now switching gears, my final question, and this is slightly removed from your research, but I think there's a very sort of important justice dimension to climate debates. And especially if you're sitting in a developing country, it's very common to hear the view that historically developing countries have sort of been the least sort of contributors to greenhouse gas emissions, but they're facing the brunt of climate change. So when you hear views such as that, and given the context and the findings from your research, which shows that clearly there's much that can be done within countries themselves by governments themselves, and perhaps not at too much cost. So what do you think policymakers should be doing? Should they be pursuing climate justice, or should they also be sort of looking at fixing domestic policies, fixing incentive structures, underlying environmental management?
I mean, I think the answer is exactly as you said in your question, which is, of course, at the international forums, we need to demand as a developing country, some kind of finance, climate finance, and so on. But that shouldn't be reason to not do anything locally. And my work is showing that there's a lot that can be done locally to improve the lives of ordinary citizens now instead of in some distant future. So that doesn't, just because there are debates internationally, and rightfully so, on who's emitting more and who deserves, transfers as a result, doesn't mean that you stop doing work immediately at the local level.
Right, great. It was a pleasure to have you, Saad, and thank you very much for joining us on this episode. We wish you all the very best for your research.
Thank you very much.